I would like to thank you for joining us. This is what's called a Skill Builder webinar, How to Facilitate the Culture of Data Use Workshop with REL Resources. And it's hosted by the Urban School Improvement Alliance at REL Northeast Islands. And at this time, I'd like to introduce Kayleen Cook, who's the researcher for USIA, and she'll be kicking off today's webinar and introducing our speakers. So good afternoon, Kayleen, and have a great session.
Thank you, Peter. So welcome to the Culture of Data Use webinar. I'm Kayleen Cook, and I'm a researcher with the Urban Schools Improvement Alliance, and that is the REL Alliance that is sponsoring this event. So the Urban School Improvement Alliance is focused on improving low-performing schools, and in particular, we help to build capacity among our members to use and access data to address questions around improving low-performing schools. Our members are interested in examining school performance within larger social, organizational, and instructional contexts. So this relates greatly to the topic of creating a culture of data use. So I would now like to welcome today's webinar presenters. We have Candace Bocala, who is a research associate with WestEd, where her work includes designing professional development workshops to support educators with data use. Candace has worked with schools and districts directly as a data coach. She has also supported state-level policymakers to use an improvement process to improve results for students with disabilities. Her other work includes studying the impact of educator evaluation systems and evaluating professional development. We also are joined by Nancy Gerzon, who is a senior program associate with WestEd. She works with superintendents, principals, coaches, and teacher leaders to analyze data to build internal capacity and to develop strategies for sustained improvement. Nancy provides professional development to district and school teams to implement internal systems that include the use of data as a lever for improving both school and district systems and classroom instruction. In recent years, Nancy has focused on training teacher leaders to align standards, instruction, assessment, and supporting teachers to use daily evidence of learning to guide instruction. We are also joined by a practitioner today, Kim Nugent, who is an instructional data coach from New York. I will now hand the presentation over to Candace.
This is Candace, and I'm just going to begin by talking about our learning goals for our session this afternoon. We're going to, as a result of this webinar, understand better how to use the resources that are contained in the toolkit. And as Peter mentioned, if you have not already downloaded the toolkit, you can do so from the box below the slides that says download today's file. That's actually the slides for today. And then there's a second CDU toolkit link, and you can download it directly from that link. We're also going to be more prepared to facilitate this workshop, hopefully at your site. A key emphasis during our presentation today is we're not going to go through every element that's contained in the Culture of Data Use workshop step by step, but we are going to talk about it in terms of what a facilitator would need to know if he or she were organizing a professional development or professional learning experience for other people using this toolkit. We do encourage you to download the toolkit if you'd like to look at it in more detail. And then finally, we really want you to think about how you might revise these materials based on your context, based on your knowledge of the schools and districts that you work with, or other populations that you work with, because when we put together these materials, we always intend for those people in the field to understand how they would adapt them or tailor them to your own context. Here's how we're going to do that over the course of the next hour and 15 minutes or so. We're here in the welcome and overview. We will hear from a practitioner who has helped us to organize this workshop with some districts that she works with. We'll go through those elements of the toolkit, talk a little bit about why we designed a toolkit about culture and what culture means, and then present some facilitation tips. Then we're going to hear again from our practitioner who is going to reflect on the impact of doing this workshop with her districts that she works with and close with our evaluation. So I'd like to turn it over now to Kim Nugent, who will tell us a little bit more about her role and the experience of working with districts around this workshop.
Great, thank you, Candace. My name is Kim Nugent, and I'm an instructional data coach here at Capital Region BOCES in Albany, New York. And just for those of you who are not from New York, just to give you a sense of what a BOCES is, we're a Board of Cooperative Educational Services, and we provide shared programming and services to a group of school districts. And there are 37 BOCES within New York State, and there are 23 school districts within my Capital Region BOCES. So I am a coach that works with pretty much all of these 23 different school districts. So to give you some background into how I got involved with this workshop, in the fall of 2013, I was a participant in the initial workshop, which is the Building Capacity for Data Use in Schools. During this workshop, REL mentioned there was a second workshop focused on building a culture of data use. Having worked with my districts, I knew that in many districts, the culture piece was a big piece that was lacking. So when I heard about this workshop, I thought it was a very appealing topic that could benefit the districts that I work with. So I worked with REL to plan out this workshop, and we did it as basically a large group, in a large group setting. I invited all of my 23 districts to participate, and 9 districts did join. So we had about 65 people participating in the workshop, and it was a mix of diverse districts, rural, urban, suburban. Diverse teams were sent from the districts. We had anywhere from a team of 1 to a team of about 11 or 12, made up primarily of leaders, whether it was superintendents, assistant superintendents, principals, teacher leaders, with the goal of starting to look at the big picture and to develop consistent language and resources that could help the leadership start to think about how to use data to guide teacher practice. Each district was at a different point in their data use, so it was really great to get them all together hearing the same message. I've learned that teachers and administrators sometimes don't always value data as an instructional tool. For example, the state test might be viewed as more of an accountability measure and not a method or a measure of student achievement and teaching and how we can improve teaching and learning. So we wanted to get the groups together to have this conversation and give them the information they would need to bring back to their respective districts to start to build that culture. And it was successful, and I will talk later in the presentation about how some of these districts use this information and have made a lot of progress in utilizing data to help students improve. So I guess I'll turn it back over to Candace, who will talk more about the workshop.
Great, thank you, Kim. One of the key ideas that I'd love to underline in what you said was about the value of bringing districts and schools within one district together to hear a common message. And that is one of the intentions behind a toolkit like this. So we'd like to kick off our presentation by asking you how many people have downloaded and read the toolkit. That's okay if you haven't downloaded it yet. One of the things we'd like to know is just who's in the audience so we can tailor some of our suggestions. If you have happened to read through it, or if you've actually used it in professional development or other work, we would love to hear how you have used it and how it was received. That's good feedback for us here at REL. It looks like that about 60% 6 of you have not yet downloaded, well, I'll just remind you that you can do so from the link that's below the slide. 18 of you have either taken advantage of downloading it now or have downloaded it in the past, and 5 of you have gone ahead and read through it, which is great. Those of you who have taken a look at it, if you have questions for us that have come up as you've looked at it, please do put those in the chat. We'd also like to invite you to take advantage of the chat to post any questions that come up. We see these webinars as trying to be as interactive as possible, and if you do have a question, we can pause and address it. So we'll go back now to the slides. So the toolkit itself contains a few key materials. The toolkit together contains a facilitator guide and a set of handouts. There's also a separate slide deck that you can download and customize. The facilitator guide pages contain a lot of information about how to frame the workshop, including discussion prompts and recommendations for how to facilitate the different protocols. And those of us who've worked in professional development or coaching, those are always helpful because they really give you some insight into how participants are likely to respond and what a facilitator might do in order to get the best discussion possible. There's also a set of handouts, which again is useful because you don't have to recreate material. You can just download it and photocopy it or customize it to whatever you need. And the slides are a generic version of PowerPoint slides that you can also customize. And we're going to be showing you some of the slides that we use in the workshop and talking you through a little bit about how we have framed this content when we've worked with practitioners. So to get us started with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Nancy, who's going to talk about why we need a toolkit about the culture of data use.
Thanks, Candace. So I actually have a proposal for you to think about putting something in the chat because this is kind of a funny question that we were asked as researchers to help people think about what is a culture of data use. And when we were first asked this question, we really weren't entirely sure what was meant by the term culture. And so when you think about a culture of data use, if you would take a moment just to put some ideas in the chat if you've thought about that and frame out what you think that means. Because what we found and what I'll talk about here and also try to refer to some of your thoughts is that people who were asking for this actually weren't quite sure what they were asking about, and we really had to do a lot of digging to understand that. So in this, I want to frame this out because when I think about facilitating this particular workshop, I think one of the most important things that you can have as a facilitator is an understanding of what we even meant when we thought about what culture is, the idea of what a data using culture is. Basically what people told us when we first asked them is what's happening in places that are pretty good at using data. In other words, that nobody's asking you to do it. It's not something that is still needing tons of professional learning, or we're still not focusing on it as an introductory process, but it's something that's just happening. What are the things that are in place in schools where this work is underway and when teachers are regularly using evidence of learning? We dug into that a little bit more, and we asked the Alliance members who were requesting this, well, tell us more about that. What are some things that come to mind? And one of the things that came to mind was what Kim raised earlier, which is that schools are doing a lot of work to move from a transition of having an accountability focus of data to a learning focus for data. And this transition is pretty well documented in the field, and we'll talk about it a little bit more in just a moment. But the question on the table was really that a big part of some Alliance members thinking about what they meant by culture of data use is that data is focused on learning. It's focused more on learning, and in that way, shorter cycle information might be used in the classroom. Teachers have ready access to data that's really going to help them support instruction. other folks were thinking more about some issues related to special populations or individual personalizing education, and really thought about the difference between what happens in schools where we've moved from doing a lot of work in aggregate data or large scale, in many cases, large scale analysis of data, to focusing on how teachers can use individual data, or how they can really focus on personalizing instruction, or as Maria has said just below, that it's guiding instructional decision-making, or decision-making, as she said, focused on teaching and learning. And similarly, as Paula mentioned below, the idea of this being embedded in practice, that comes into this piece, that teachers are regularly using that individual level data to guide practice. So we took this idea from the very start of introducing this toolkit to really try to define this idea of what is a culture of data use. And I think that though we're in the midst of this shift, a culture of data use could be at any point on this continuum that you see in front of you now. You could have a daily use of data or regular use of data to support school improvement, to support different kinds of decision making, and that still, for me, is a culture of data use. But in this particular slide, which is it's research documented by Means, Fadil, and Gallagher in 2010, they described in their research looking across the United States that they saw 3 different stages that schools are in looking at data, and these align with that continuum that we just saw. The first stage is more focused on accountability data, and data is often used for placement decisions. We often see a lot of this data, which is still very important to use, to think about grading and reporting practices and other kinds of practices that are required components of our school systems. As we think about that data more specifically, teachers often get to the point of saying, I want more clear information about what to do with groups of students, or how I would disaggregate data or provide moving towards more individualized data. And at this point in the development of schools' data use, we see much more of a focus on data that, say, for instance, like benchmark data or midpoint assessment data that's focused on work that really helps us get smart about curriculum issues, student grouping issues. And we often see, for instance, schools that are working with reteach groups or things of that nature where teachers are learning at this stage to really talk about student data in some specific ways to help ongoing instruction. As we move into what they reported in their research on stage 3, they look at this idea of focusing work on comparative analysis of student growth, and the focus shifts from sort of what we're thinking about teaching or how we're approaching the curriculum to how we're approaching our instruction. And this stage 3 is very much what we thought the Alliance members were asking us to write about when they talked about a culture of data use. So we went a little bit deeper into the research, and this just helps frame what's the culture of data use. And we found that there was this really now a 4th stage. We find this especially true in the formative assessment literature and some of the research coming out on differentiated instruction, that in this 4th stage, there's a direct link between assessment and learning, and there's a much more clear focus on individualized daily student data that is organized around this immediate feedback with students. Now, my belief system is you could be anywhere on this continuum and you could have an effective culture of data use. But many schools, as they move through these stages, we're seeing some very specific information that, or skill sets that are changing amongst teachers and administrators to help develop this closer to instruction data use that we see. I personally believe, and this is not necessarily grounded in the research, but in my experience in working for many, many years with schools on data use issues, that these stages are natural periods of growth for schools. And it would be very difficult for a school to jump into stage 4 without having gone through those previous stages. So I think this is very important, and goes again to the points that we heard earlier about this idea of data being a habit of mind, a habit of practice, as Shane mentioned, and really embedded in everyday instruction, the way we do business when nobody's looking. So actually, just before I go there, I'm interested in hearing from the chat. We're not doing a poll with this because we thought it would be helpful for you to see these stages out there. If you'd be interested in putting some thoughts up about where you think your school or district, depending on who you're representing, might be with regards to those stages, knowing, for instance, most of the schools that I work with, I think, are somewhere about stage 2. I have a few that are stage 3 and 1 or 2 that are stage 4, and we've written about them in the Culture of Data Use Toolkit as examples of good practice. So I'm seeing Beth Waterman mention that her district is, she's thinking at stage 2. And I'll be curious to see what others might say if they enter that into the chat as to where theirs might be. So I'm going to pause here and also see if I'm seeing some chat in some places and some on others. So, and Helen, is that Helena Randall that's moving? It said stage 1, and again we see Marty Montal talking about stage 2 and Monique talking about stage 2. So there's a preponderance of folks talking about stage 1 and 2, which is very consistent with what Candace and I, and also Kim, we've talked about this, see when we're going to meet with schools and districts on this work. Excellent, and quite a few more stage 2s coming in as well. This is helpful for us to know in thinking about this, and I just want to say one more thing as we move along this piece. And Shane, thank you for mentioning stage 4. So we'll be interested in hearing some thoughts that you have about how this continuum may fit, and if you've gone through those various stages in your school or district. One of the things that we just hold on to when we're thinking about this is that many of the things that we wrote about in the Culture of Data Use Toolkit are focused on stage 3 and 4 schools. And the reason for that is that though all of these are important, the examples we wanted them to be in the toolkit, we wanted them to be more focused on the learning side than on the accountability side. And so organizing around the materials and resources in that way was very important for us. So going to pause here for a moment and recognize that several people sent in some questions in advance of the webinar, identifying some thoughts they had in starting out or some questions they had. And this first question, what's the best way to facilitate a culture for data analysis, is something that really, I think, speaks to the full Culture of Data Use Toolkit and why it was written. The kinds of practices that need to be in place, which we're going to see in just a moment, involve a lot of different aspects of school practice. It's not just the meetings that teachers have. It's not just the leadership for this. It's not just the way that we disseminate data. But it involves really thinking about a number of different characteristics for everyone. And what we found as we looked at these practices in the research and began to develop the outline for the toolkit was the following. The culture in order to have an effective culture of data use wherever you are on that continuum, there are 5 elements that need to be fairly fully established and also established, none can be missing. So the first is participating in the flow of information for evidence use, which basically means that there's information getting out to teachers about student learning or school processes, whatever those things are that you're looking at. The second, as we go across, that there's resources and assistance given to teachers and administrators to make meaning from data. And those resources may be opportunities to meet. They may be data coaches. They may be systems like data walls, right, provide that kind of ongoing support that there's ongoing evidence being offered. It may be that there are new schedules put in place to provide the time for teachers to meet, and that's critical. The third one going around here is providing professional development on data use knowledge and skills. This means that everybody is responsible for learning new approaches to using data in an ongoing way, and that professional development isn't just left for teachers to figure that out on their own, but gives people an opportunity to really learn together. Next, down at the very bottom, a fourth characteristic is that there is leadership that nurtures an ongoing focus on developing a culture of data use, and that leaders are supported and trained, and most importantly, held accountable for helping develop the skills of teachers, faculty, and other members of the community in using data. And finally, that there's clarity in an ongoing way around communicating professional expectations for data use, and that those expectations are held consistently across districts and schools, and everybody is held to those same standards, and that there's some accountability for those expectations. The workshop toolkit is structured around these 5 elements. And basically what it does is it provides a research lens to say, here are examples. Here's what the research says is important in each of these areas. And here are examples of practice. And those examples of practice are meant to be an opportunity for participants to sort of be inspired and to explore what other folks are doing. Because one thing we know is absolutely true, that the development of a culture of data use looks different in different places, right? Different systems get put into place, different ways of approaching things, but that if these 5 elements are approached with care and attention, all 5 of them, you really see some dramatic improvement. And you can even think about, what happens when one of these is missing or 2 of these is missing. The rest of these elements really suffer. And so thinking about how to organize around that is one of the main outcomes for this workshop. This just gives you an example very briefly, and for those of you who have downloaded the toolkit, you can actually just go in and take a look at this because I realize this is too much text for the slide, but this is just to give you a sense of how different materials and resources in the toolkit have been organized around these 5 elements. In this particular example, there's a summary of research findings, and then there's research vignettes that follow up each of the 5 elements for more information on those as well. So I'd love to have a discussion here, and this will come into the chat. And I see that actually Maria has already noted what we're going to ask. So this is perfect. Good timing and a good start to the discussion. So the discussion is, which of the culture elements are a strength in your system? And if you can, share an example of what work in your school or district has taken place to create an effective practice. And so Candace has done a nice job of asking Maria for some more details, where she said, I'm proud to say that we've been rather successful with all areas of this framework. We look forward to continuing and enhancing data use in our schools and across the district. And I think that's fantastic that they have been focusing on all 5. We find, Candace and I have found going out into schools, that it can be difficult to focus on all 5 of these at once and take some very focused attention in that area. So I'm going to pause for just a moment and stop talking to give time for those who are typing to post some things in the chat. I'm going to go to something that Heather said earlier and adding in this idea of that it's really important to have high levels of assessment literacy. The assessment literacy piece in this framework comes in along the right side of the framework, where it talks about providing resources and assistance and providing professional development. There's something interesting about assessment literacy when we look at the research, which I think is just worth mentioning, that assessment literacy for teachers involves both knowing how to look at the data and a strong grounding in your content. And so this idea of thinking about where that comes from, to say there's both a need to provide time and opportunity to meet for that, and to have possibly professional experts or data coaches or academic coaches working together to really bring that about. And I think that's a powerful point, that assessment literacy is a significant part of this. And I see in the chat that multiple folks are typing. So looking forward to hearing some strengths that folks have in their system. Interestingly, I have worked in urban, suburban, and rural schools. And one of the things that I've noticed in doing this work is that this idea of sort of setting up data systems to support the flow of information has been particularly challenging in rural environments. And I think that might be something that folks are thinking about. What are some things that we might do in urban areas? We find that that's often done quite well. So Maria has said, we've provided professional development on data use over the years. Schools have data walls, data chats with all stakeholders. This has been a concerted effort to improve teaching and learning. I want to mention the idea of data walls, and thank you, Maria, for bringing this up. The framing of data walls as a concept in the framework really falls into a number of different categories, and for that purpose, it's a very effective way of both really getting information out that folks can use and see and be part of regularly, so that it becomes part of our conversation. It's public. It becomes part of how we do business, or public to teachers. But it also promotes very quick, short-cycle conversations that we see in the on the right-hand side of the framework around providing resources and getting teachers to really talk about that. It really provides opportunities and structures for teachers to think about this quite differently. So thank you, Maria, for mentioning that. Heather talks about thinking about strong grounding in content. Oh, so thank you for mentioning strong grounding in content. As a data coach with a strong background in assessment and data analysis, it can be a roadblock to moving forward the data culture if you don't have those strong instructional leaders. I can't agree more. And one of the things that I've done in several schools where I've worked is really reframed for leaders how important it is to have a strong content person in the room whenever we're doing data analysis. So I think that's an important piece and helps build that culture in a very specific way. Shane, I love what you've put here, that we utilize district building and teacher-based team to align goals and set expectations. This is perfect in the communicate professional expectations about data use. And it does something else where it allows, as you've said, Shane, it allows the teacher teams to look at classroom data to identify specific information on student needs, but at the same time, you'll also have, if you're working with building and district teams, you'll also have those groups focusing on the right kind of data for their decision making. And I think that's fantastic. And thank you, Beth, in mentioning we are most successful in the areas of participating in the flow of information and providing resources, and it seems that and providing leadership. And I imagine those things are tightly linked for you. And again, mention data walls. So this gives you a sense, I think, of seeing this work play out. And that important piece that we want to just hold on to here is that this framing is very much kind of at the meta level for leaders in this particular toolkit. And as you can see from the kinds of conversations that we're having right now, it really focuses on those big elements that need to be in place with a little less detail on exactly what's inside of them, although that is available through the examples in the vignettes. So we're going to do a poll right now, and I'm going to ask that Jenny pull this up. And the poll is for you to think about, from what you know right now, many of you have just downloaded the toolkit and are just learning about this, but from what you know right now, how might you structure using this? And this will help us in the next segment of the workshop as we talk about some facilitation strategies and tips. I'll give you a moment to fill that out. And I see so far we see a combination of several days and webinar. Just mention a couple of thoughts. I'm delighted to see the several days in person and the webinars, which also could be multiple sessions. This toolkit is designed because we were asked to design it as a full day in-person workshop, so we designed it specifically that way for the Alliance purposes. And it makes sense to do that because that's the way that PD is available much of the time. But in reality, I think the content, and especially this workshop, which has a lot of text, it's a lot of reading, the benefit of doing a full day is that you really get people talking the same language quickly and focusing on some of these concrete things. The benefit of doing several days is that you'll have more time to kind of analyze and dig in to a lot of the text that's in the workshop toolkit and pick and choose more about the things that you feel would be good fits for your district based on where your district is and what stage you're in. Different things will feel like they're different fits. So this will be helpful for us as we move to the next slide and talk a little bit about tips. Candace, I'll turn this back to you.
Thank you, Nancy. This might be a good time to mention as well that we have done this session both in webinar format and also in person. And when we do it in webinar format, I think prompts like the one that we just used, where you invite the group to share out what their experience has been with those 5 elements and to do a little bit of a self-assessment about where they might be on the continuum of data use practices, really gets that audience involved. And so we've just demonstrated a couple of the ways that we have, in fact, used this toolkit in different audiences via webinar. So in terms of tips for facilitating the session, when we have done it more in person, we do quite a bit of reviewing the research, or what we call vignettes. Other people might refer to them as case studies that are in the toolkit. And you'll notice that the toolkit is really rich with examples. And so many of you had questions before this session about what is the best practice with X. For example, getting teachers to talk about data. The toolkit contains those examples, and we know that educators are really hungry to see how other districts of different settings have done this work. So we have been sure to include both urban districts, suburban, and rural schools. So you can see that this work looks different, but also develops over time in each of those settings. So a big part of what happens as participants experience the toolkit is they're reading and they're reviewing the best practice from the research or examples of models in practice where other people have tried it out. And then they're going to consider those implications for their own research or their own practice, and then apply what they've learned by either creating next steps or plans for when they go back to their schools or districts, and thinking about what is one part of that framework that they might want to focus on. As Nancy mentioned, you really need all 5 elements to constitute a well-rounded culture of data use, but you do have to start somewhere. And so some groups that we've worked with have decided we're really not sure what the expectations are around data use. We don't have any clear communication about who is supposed to use what data, and there's no guidance coming from the district about how data is supposed to be reviewed. So maybe that is something we would like to put into play. And so when you think about facilitating this session, one of the facilitation challenges is managing the large amount of shared reading that happens. And so this is a moment where we'd also like you to think about what are some strategies that you've used in your work that you can share with the audience about structuring large amounts of reading or large amounts of text. those of you who've been classroom teachers, you can also think about strategies that maybe work for your students as well for your adult learners. So a few that we use that are in the toolkit itself are the Each Teach strategy, where it's partnered reading, and one person reads one section, somebody else reads another section, and then you teach each other the content of that section. A similar method is the jigsaw, where you have multiple people, maybe a group of 4, each reading 4 different sections coming together in a group that's an expert group to discuss that one section, and then going back to a group where there's somebody who's read each part of the full reading. We've also done summarizing techniques like a key point review, where you write down the main ideas, and paragraph summaries, where you try to say what you think the main idea is, or the common takeaways in about a paragraph. So those are some of the strategies that we have used, but we realize that making meaning of text can be challenging. So I wonder from you, if you could put in the chat, if you have any favorite strategies for working with adult learners when it comes to making meaning of text. So while you're thinking about that, and if you're adding into the chat, I'll just mention one more strategy that I really like. It's the Save the Last Word protocol. Those of you who have used this protocol, you can find it easily online. It's pretty commonly available, but the idea is somebody will read a section of text, and then in a group you can say what section of text you chose, but then everybody else in the group has a reaction to that section of text, and then the person who introduced that section gets to speak last and say why they chose to share it and what it meant for them. So you kind of save the last word for that person. So that's an additional protocol that's not in the toolkit, but that I like and that I've used before. I don't see any ideas coming into the chat, so I guess we'll move along. But if you can think of any more, just go ahead and put that in there. We are all about sharing our practice with one another, especially those of you who work in professional development or coaching. So I'm going to let Nancy talk a little bit about the importance of developing guidance.
Thanks, Candace. One of the major findings from the research overview that we did was that it's absolutely essential that districts and schools develop written guidance for data use practices, and it's actually rare. We're all in the process of trying to figure out this, build this plane while we're flying it. And oftentimes practices are implemented or PD activities take place, and it's not entirely clear what the purpose of that is. So we offer in this workshop that we want people to walk away with a sense of knowledge, understanding, and skills to develop the culture, but that the primary outcome, the primary output of teams would be that they identify an element of focus and that they develop guidance for that particular element. And we know that when it comes to really thinking about doing this when nobody's looking, or making this a part of embedded practice, that clarifying and being just very direct about what the actual expectations are for different aspects of data use practice is very important. And I would say that in this regard, that's actually true in all 5 of the element areas. So thinking about how to structure this workshop and who to invite to this workshop can be benefited from knowing that the major outcome that teams will have as a result of this is written documentation about what their expectations are in each of the 5 elements. And we start in the workshop with one of those elements of focus, so you've written guidance from one area. But the overall, over time expectations is that teams learn about that skill and then use that, leadership teams use that moving forward. So I'm going to, and just as thinking about that piece, I'm going to ask Kim to talk a little bit more about her experience when she brought a group her large group together from her districts in the BOCES region and what the outcomes were for some of the districts that she worked with.
Hey, thank you. So I wanted to talk a little bit about our experience here at Capital Region BOCES in going through this workshop and the impact that it has had on the participating school districts. As I mentioned before, we did do this workshop as a full-day workshop. We had a host site that was very gracious to provide us with a large room, and we were able to host 9 different districts with various group sizes and generally made up of leadership from the various districts. The benefit of this was twofold. You had groups from districts that had time to talk to each other, and then you also, the participants were also able to talk across districts, which we don't get that opportunity very often. So that was a really nice benefit of doing it in this way. So from a results standpoint, as I mentioned, our goal was to provide a big picture overview and provide common language and resources for the districts to bring back and utilize with their staff to help improve teaching and learning. I would say as a result, all 9 of the districts did gain something from the workshop and the resources. In general, I've seen districts become more interested in talking about data. The culture has definitely been shifting to more of a data-driven culture, more data conversations, which in my experience, and I've been doing this is my 3rd year now, I've seen a shift from the teacher, I guess, hunches or intuition that might have been driving their instruction to more looking at student, data and figuring out how to best meet the needs of the students in front of them. So that's been a very positive change just in general. What I'd like to do now is highlight 2 specific districts that did participate and talk about how I worked with them as a follow-up to help move them even more in this process. So the first district was a small city school district, and they had asked me not long after the workshop to meet with them and meet with a leadership team to talk about the resources and talk about how they might utilize the resources, again, to encourage the use of data, with their teachers. So we got together and we met, and as we reviewed the resources with the group, because not everyone had gone to the workshop, the one that stood out the most was an assessment inventory. And it led to some great conversations amongst the leaders of the various buildings. And in particular, this district has 3 elementary buildings. So the leadership of the 3 buildings started to have a conversation about assessments. And, well, what assessments are you doing in the elementary grades? And maybe we should start talking about this a little bit more and having some consistency across our buildings so that the kids are having, similar assessments so that we can talk as a larger grade level across the district. And it was really an aha moment, and it was nice to see that happen. In the same district, they're also starting to create more time and structures for teachers to have these data conversations, whether it's state test data or NWEA data or just classroom data in general. There's been a push for creating PLC time and giving the grade level teachers time to start having these conversations, and then in turn using that to help the students learn. So that was one experience with the small city district. The other district I'll share was our host district, who is a suburban district. And they have made a huge shift in data use and really are working hard to create that culture in their district. Again, not long after the workshop, I was invited to work with the district leadership team, and we actually worked on developing a protocol that they felt would allow data conversations in their district. And the way we did this is we actually had some data, and I believe it was might have been 8th grade math data from the state assessment. And we took time to analyze some of their reports, and we actually, as a team, went through the protocol together. And this was a protocol that had been adapted from another district. They then worked to tweak the protocol to meet what they thought, or to make it what they thought would meet the needs of their own district. And this was a really great experience. Again, I think, the leaders, it's important to build that leadership capacity so they can bring that back to their staff. So once they tweak this protocol to meet the needs, their needs as a district, they then asked me to come back with the new protocol to work with teachers, and these were teachers that had been participating in a PD course throughout the year. So it was teacher leaders, and I worked with this group in mixed teams, and it was a K-12 group in mixed teams, and we had various data reports to look at. We went through the protocol together and shared our experiences, or shared our findings from the data, and we're able to make some really nice connections as a K-12 continuum based on what we were seeing in the data. So again, it was a great experience for that group, who could then take this protocol back to the teachers that they work with. And this district has really been running with this, and they're currently working on developing common assessments to continue to facilitate these conversations, and continue to build that culture that values data. So those are just two examples, specific examples of districts. But like I said, I would say all of the 9 districts were able to take something out of this that they could bring back and help facilitate that culture within their own schools.
Thank you, Kim.
Thank you.
There are, several factors, obviously, that come into play when, you see change in practice at the district level. And, what we're hoping is that by starting out with presenting that framework of the culture elements, the districts have a chance to have a conversation about what are we doing, and are we consistent, and do we have all 5 elements addressed? Are we missing one element? Are we strong in one element, and maybe we could use some support in another element? So the value of having that framework is really to get people to start these conversations based in what we know from research and from examples of real schools. I'll also mention that another common takeaway that we find is people really do love those examples. So they'll go back to them and they'll see, oh, here's an example of a completed district assessment inventory that outlines what the purpose of looking at these different sources of data are, and that different sources of data might be examined for different purposes. So somebody had a question in the pre-webinar registration questions about what's the best way to get people talking about the different purposes. There's an example of that in this toolkit, and those examples really resonate once practitioners have a chance to see them and discuss them and say, we need something exactly like this with our school. So how do we get that done? So we'll talk a little bit about setting participants up for success and having those kinds of conversations when they attend the workshop in person. This can also be considered in terms of webinar attendance, and you can have these same messages go out when you invite people to attend the webinar. But what we usually ask is that we have people attending in a team. Team conversations in this case are really valuable. As we know from professional development literature, individual learning can go a long way, but team learning and collaborative learning really allows educators to share ideas and make sense of new information. So what we ask is for people to come in either district or school-based teams, and we really do want somebody to be there who has leadership authority. So ideally it contains an administrator, somebody who works with data regularly, and other instructional leaders, as well as classroom teachers who can make those connections to their day-to-day work and the content. But because so much of the workshop is really focused on creating structures and routines that have to be implemented across a school or a district, it does help to have somebody who has some decision-making authority be on that team so they can identify what the next steps might be. Another suggestion that we have, which is true for, I think, any good professional development, is to make sure that the group leaves with some idea of what their key takeaways are and how they're going to incorporate what they have learned into their next steps. So we often conclude with a reflective activity where we have them synthesize their learning and then write down 2 or 3 next steps that we ask them to share with a neighbor or with their team about what they're going to do. Maybe that team that decided that they don't have a assessment inventory that shows the purpose of all the data that they collect. Maybe they've decided they want to get together at their next district meeting and create that together. That's a perfect example of a way to take something they have learned from the workshop into their setting. Then we also remind people that these materials are publicly available and able for download at any time. And we really encourage people to share them, to use them, and that's why they were created. So now we're actually going to move into a little bit of Q&A with the folks in the audience, and we'll go back and answer any questions that we didn't have a chance to answer before. So we have Nancy, myself, and Kim who are able to answer any of the questions that have come up for you or might have come up for you as you are doing this work. So go ahead and put some questions into the chat. If you have any. If you are skimming through the toolkit, the assessment inventory that I mentioned is on page H50 and page H51, and I'll go ahead and put that into the chat as well. So as we're waiting for questions to come in, we have one from Shane. Can we provide any examples of how you instruct classroom teachers on how to, thinking that to use the data from their classrooms? Kim, I don't know if you want to take that a little bit. You've got, I think, more recent experience working in classrooms. Do you have some go-to strategies or protocol for working with classroom teachers?
Well, I think you hit it on the head earlier. It's important to have a content specialist that can, if available, that can help, because as a data coach, I can walk teachers through the data, and I can help guide them into what maybe strengths and weaknesses might be. But when you can team up with a content specialist, I feel like that really can help move teachers in the right direction. I think the other piece with classroom data is that sometimes teachers, in my experience at least, they hear the word data and they automatically think, you know, sheets with numbers, and you know, that's not always the case. Maybe it's, you know, they're making note of what they're observing, you know, with student responses, or maybe they're collecting exit tickets. So I think that's a big piece as well, and that might be part of the culture, you know, defining what data is, and then best figuring out how do we collect it and how do we respond to it. Because maybe you collect an exit ticket and you take a look at it and you know the next day if students got the main idea of the lesson or they didn't. And then you can respond in the moment the next day, you know, as to what you're seeing. So I think, you know, defining what data is, and then also trying to work with the content people, the content experts, can be really key as well.
And this is Nancy, I would add to that, Shane, that several of the vignettes are stories in the Workshop Toolkit, are stories of the specific shift from having teachers working in teams to look at data and then adopting those skills so that they're looking at that data more individually and making more in-the-moment decisions with data. One of the vignettes in particular follows a rural school that they were about 6 years into working with data, and they had been doing reteach work, and the teachers had developed some skills using some shorter cycle assessments, every 2-week common assessments that they had developed over time, and the teachers had developed significant assessment literacy knowledge and revamping their curriculum, develop aligned standards, this work that you described that you did, and then developing aligned assessments to those standards, and it had taken several years to really work this through. The data work, though, that was interesting that happened is it almost happened by a virtue of the teacher saying, I can do more with this information. So I have this good information, I have this good skill set. Now what are the things that I need to do to be able to respond in the moment? And it literally generated without professional learning on the part of the school, where teachers were just taking it the next logical step and moving along that continuum with the data that they had. So it was, the way that I thought about that was developing the assessment literacy and alignment, the understanding of alignment between instruction and assessment, and getting that tighter and tighter for teachers through professional learning and work together, and then kind of taking that into the classroom itself. I think, Candace, you are...
Yes, there's a question actually about working as an external partner, and it seems like Justin works with literacy, and it sounds like they bring a content area background, but they haven't yet bridged over into working with those groups around assessment. And I think actually the assessment inventory type activity that I mentioned might be a good place to start. Asking your teachers that you work with, what kinds of data do you collect in order to see the results of the literacy work that you're doing? Is this data gotten from curriculum-based measures? Is it gotten from interim assessments? Is it teachers' anecdotal data? Is it homework and classwork or student work? What is all the data that they collect around those literacy practices that you're coaching, and then begin to build in a routine for examining that data. So, one of the suggestions in the toolkit is to figure out what is the purpose of this data, because you can't examine all the data all the time. So coming to some agreement about what data is easily accessible, and then do you have a routine or a protocol when you meet together to look at that data. Obviously, looking at standardized assessment results is very different than looking at student work or writing samples. So those are some places where you might tap into either the toolkit or similar resources. There's lots of protocols available online that you can search for looking at student work. And those are the kinds of things where you can start with them right away. But I think a good first step is to figure out what data are out there that the teachers are already collecting or could be collecting that has to do with literacy. There's a question that I received from a participant about, is there a place that gives a one-page summary for a district team to quickly review the 5 areas? And I was just skimming through, and yes, there absolutely is. There's several summaries, actually, of the 5 elements, but one that I found is a handout on page H25, and that's handout 5.3, which is the findings from the research about each of the 5 elements. And Nancy, I'm not sure if you know where that short summary is.
That's the best one. Yeah,
okay,
that's the best one, especially for leaders to look at. Mm-hmm.
Good, good. So one of the ideas is that we look at each of these elements very deeply, and you'll see each element represented in multiple ways. One example is, what does the research say about this element? Another example is, what does it look like in practice? Those are those examples that I was mentioning. Then there's even examples of what are some common barriers or challenges to getting these elements off the ground and started. So the toolkit really digs deeply underneath each of those 5 elements. So I'll just pause here and see if there's any other questions. I don't see any new ones coming in to the chat. We're ending up, we're coming to the end here, and we just want to remind you, before you go, please do give us your feedback. You'll see a box below the slides with what we call a stakeholder feedback survey, and our technical producers just put the link into the chat. Don't forget to fill out this evaluation before you go. That is data that we use to improve our own practice as the REL team, and so we really value your feedback. It just takes a few minutes, so please click on that link, and before you go, please let us know what you think. But just moving on here to these last few chat questions to take advantage of our audience of leaders and professional developers and educators. Do you currently use resources like this toolkit at your site? And if so, what are they? Can you share them with the audience so that we can all benefit from what you use? And if you don't have anything like this, how do you think you might use a toolkit like this to support your educators? So go ahead and put that into the chat. And we'll see what other resources we have. Seems like people are thinking, or they don't have anything quite like this. I think one of the points that Nancy mentioned earlier is the need for this toolkit came about because people used to say the word culture, but there really wasn't a definition of what that meant, or when we say we need a culture for data use, there was no definition for what that looked like, and so that's why this was created. So I think this toolkit is unique in that respect. There may not be anything quite like it. Nancy or Kim, do you have any other related resources or anything that you've used in your practice that you would suggest to our group?
We would love to have people keep in touch with us, and I thank you, Shane, for writing in the chat. I've been looking for this for a while. Let us know how it goes for you, and I say that to Shane and then to others of you who are looking into using the Workshop Toolkit. It's something that there isn't anything else actually like it out in the field. It's quite different. As someone who does a lot of professional development around training for skills, this is much more about learning a framework and having kind of a mental model with which to approach work we all have to do in our schools. So it's different that way, but we're curious to see how it works for all of you and if it helps you take some good next steps forward.
And I would agree that there's some really great resources available in this toolkit, so definitely if you can take advantage of them, some of them, it will be helpful.
And with this, we'd like to thank you all for being with us today on the webinar, and we are going to say goodbye. And when we do, the participant survey link will jump right up onto the screen to make sure if you haven't done that yet, you'll do that before you leave. But thank you very much, and we look forward to hearing of your progress. Our emails are on the slide deck so that when you, I think we're on the slide deck at the very end, so that you can reach out to us if you have questions or are working on doing this. And thank you very much to Kim Nugent also for joining us today and giving her voice as a practitioner. I know it's really helpful to hear the real stories from the field alongside the research. So thanks all.
Yes, and thank you all for joining.
Thank you, Nancy, Candace, and Kim. On behalf of REL Northeast Islands, thanks everyone for joining us today. In 2 or 3 weeks, you will receive a thank you email with a link to the webinar archive and the slides. And we appreciate your completing the feedback survey. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.